This video is sponsored by Casetify.
How's it going here? And welcome to my camera comparison between the all-new Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra and iPhone 14 Pro. Now, the 14 Pro and 14 Pro Max have been out for a while, and obviously the Samsung has just released the S23 series, and they're known to improve their camera systems through several software updates over time, so I may have to do a revisit video to see how it's doing. But for now, we're going to check out the S23 Ultra and how it does out of the gate against the iPhone 14 Pro. Now, the main changes to the cameras on the Ultra that Samsung has made this year is number one, the main sensor. They've gone away from the 108 megapixel Samsung HM3 sensor to the new 200 megapixel Samsung HP2 sensor. And so they're both relatively the same sensor size at 1 over 1.33 inches from last year's model to 1 over 1.3 inches on this year's model. So pretty much the same sensor size. They just pretty much doubled the megapixel count. And not everything is megapixels. I think if you're going to see any improvement, it's going to be a lot to do with the new Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 system on a chip with its image signal processing. And the second thing that Samsung has changed on the Ultra cameras is the selfie camera. They've gone from a 40 megapixel sensor from last year to a 12 megapixel camera this year. And again, megapixels aren't everything. With less megapixels this year, they also have larger individual pixels. So theoretically, you could still see some improvement in the selfie camera. And as for the other cameras, Samsung has elected to keep the same ultra wide, as well as the same 3 times and 10 times telescope and periscope zoom lenses. Now, putting all that aside, like I was doing, I'm going to show you a bunch of photos and videos in both good and low light conditions to help you decide which of these two camera systems might be best for you. And if you're like me, before you go outside to chase all your best photos and videos with your phone, you want the peace of mind that it's going to be protected, because there's always a good chance it may take a drop with the number of times you're pulling it in and out of your pocket or your bag.
I use and have personally purchased cases from today's sponsor, Casetify, because they specialize in making protective cases without feeling like you have a brick in your pocket. Their EcoShock inner lining provides up to 4 times military standards with up to 8 feet of drop protection. I've been using their impact cases with clear back to show off the S23 Ultra's color and design, the matte black for a sleeker look, and I really like this inner parts design on their impact case, and I'm sure a lot of you techies out there will too. They also have thousands of prints and customization options to make your case feel unique and express your own style. Their customizer enables you to select from different case colors and adding your own personalized text with different fonts and colors to really make it feel like a one-of-a-kind case. There are other accessory options to further protect your Galaxy S23 Ultra, like their screen protectors. They're easy to install and also adheres to the slightly curved edges of the S23 Ultra, which does not always work with other screen protectors, and is also compatible with the under-display fingerprint sensor. Another accessory that I have found useful is this phone strap, which helps to free up your pocket space so you don't always have to lug around a heavy bag, and gives you quick access to your phone so you don't miss capturing any moments.
Also, Casetify is giving you 15% off your order if you use the link in the video description. I'd like to thank Casetify for sponsoring this video and for helping me bring you more content like this. Now let's go ahead and check out all the photos and videos and let me know what you think.
Okay, I'm breaking into the music since I thought this was pretty interesting. Typically, most phones will switch back to the main sensor with a digital zoom when taking photos in close proximity to your subject, since the telephoto lens is unable to focus since it's really meant to capture things farther away. However, the S23 Ultra's 3 times telephoto sensor is able to take macro shots like these, which I think is pretty nice. All right, back to the video.
Everyone, so this will be a rear video camera test with the S23 Ultra and iPhone 14 Pro. As you can see, they both are actively recording from the rear facing cameras. We are starting out with the ultra angle cameras on each at 4K 30 frames per second. This is with HDR off on both. So I just want to give you a feel for what that looks like without HDR. Just pan around so you can get a feel for how these ultra wide angle cameras compare here in this particular setting, side by side here. So we'll go ahead and move into the main camera and on the iPhone there. So again, HDR is off on the main cameras. Just want to give you a feel for how these compare here side by side with HDR off. And I'm going to come back, turn HDR on, and we'll see what it looks like then. Alright, so we're back. HDR is turned on both. This is still the main camera, just to give you a feel for how that contrasts and compared to the video you just saw from the same camera without HDR. I'm just going to pan around here side by side, and I'll move out to the ultra wide angle camera here on each, so you can see what the ultra wide angle looks like here with HDR turned on. Lots of nice greens and blues, a little bit of clouds in the skies, so that should provide a little bit more dynamic range here, a little more contrast here, good colors to compare the color reproduction on each as well. So let's go ahead and move back into the main camera on each, on the S23 and then on the iPhone 14 Pro. Now let's pan over here to the right and we'll test zoom out on that cell tower. So you have that 3x optical telephoto lens on the S23 Ultra, same on the iPhone. You saw them both snap in there. So 3x telephoto on each. And then of course the S23 Ultra also has the 10x periscope zoom. You saw that snap in. And the iPhone's gonna max out at a 9x digital zoom. Although the digital zoom does look pretty clear and pretty steady on the iPhone. And let's see, we can go up to a max 20x digital zoom there on the Galaxy S23 Ultra, and that also looks very clear and very steady. So let's back them both out on the iPhone and on the S23 Ultra, and we'll test autofocus here on the post. So with the S23 Ultra, you can see there, and pretty challenging with the shade here. You can see it kind of focus up there and away, and focused up and away, and you can see the really shallow depth of field there on that sensor. And here we go with the 48 megapixel sensor on the iPhone 14 Pro. Really snappy autofocus there. Also, really nice shallow depth of field or natural bokeh or background blur there. And let's go ahead and test out stabilization as we walk down the stairs here, so you can see what stabilization looks like here side by side in 4K. And we'll go ahead and jog to try to stress that stabilization and see what it looks like. So there you go. Camera test. S23 Ultra, iPhone 14 Pro. All right, now we're back this time with 8K 30 frames per second on the S23 Ultra. That's new this year. And iPhone still caps out at 4K recording. And this is the main camera because there is no 8K recording on the ultra wide on the S23 Ultra. So just want to show you the same scene so you can compare 8K on the Samsung to 4K on the iPhone in the exact same scene here, same colors, everything else. And the zoom maxes out at 6x digital on the S23 Ultra at 8K. And we can go to a 6x equivalent here on the iPhone. So there you go. We'll back both these out. And I don't know if you want to see any kind of a focus test here at 8K, but we can do that. So there you go. It's nice and close and focuses up. Same really shallow depth of field there on the S23 Ultra and iPhone. Still nice and snappy, obviously. And so we can also show you stabilization here in 8K and how that looks compared to the 4K footage. We'll even jog to try to see if we can stress out that 8K stabilization. So there you go, 8K on the Samsung versus 4K on the iPhone. So this is just a quick 4K 60 frames per second test on the rear cameras. Just want to give you a feel for what that looks like here outdoors. I'm just going to move around to give you a feel for that, some of that motion and what it does look like into some changing lighting conditions here. And we'll pan all the way this way and we'll start walking just to show you what the stabilization looks like here at 4K. They both should be fully stabilized and hopefully look pretty good. Let me know what you think. So this is some cinematic video on the iPhone and portrait video on the S23 Ultra. They both should be creating that artificial background blur, and they both can shoot in 4K in this mode. The S23 Ultra has stepped it up to 4K from the 1080p on the S22 Ultra, and so I just want to give you a feel for what this looks like here outdoors. Again, I'll pan around just to see what this looks like into some changing light conditions, as well as how that background blur effect holds up with some motion. And we'll also test it out with some stabilization by walking and see how it holds up with some movement here. So let me know what you think about cinematic video at 4K and portrait video at 4K on the S23 Ultra. Alright, so here's some front-facing footage from both phones, this time at 4K 30 frames per second. So I'm just going to pan around and show you what this looks like here from the front-facing cameras and how the cameras perform in some different lighting conditions there, now with the sun directly behind me. And we pan all the way back around this way, and we start walking to show you the stabilization side by side. So let me know what you think about the 4K footage from the front-facing cameras on the S23 Ultra and iPhone 14 Pro. Alright, so we're back again with the front cameras, this time at 4K 60 frames per second. So they both should be stabilized here at 4K 60, which is really nice. And again, I'll just pan around so you can see what it looks like with the different lighting conditions. Again, with the sun directly shining on my face, and now with the sun directly behind me, what the video quality looks like here at 4K 60. And hopefully you're seeing a bit of that motion, even though this is being exported at 30 frames per second. But still, you can kind of judge the quality overall with the color reproduction and everything else, as well as with the stabilization here at 4K 60. So let me know what you think about this footage here. Everyone, again with the front-facing cameras, this time with portrait video on the S23 Ultra and cinematic mode on the iPhone 14 Pro. So they both should be reproducing this artificial background blur. The blur is adjustable on each, so if you don't want this amount of blur, you can reduce it or increase it. And they both shoot at 4K, so that's an improvement that Samsung made this year. You now shoot in 4K with portrait video on both the front and rear-facing cameras. And so again, I'll just pan around so you can see what it looks like here with the different lighting conditions. Again, sun directly shining on me, and panning around this way with it directly behind me. And again, we'll just go ahead and start walking to not only test stabilization, but see how this blur effect holds up with some movement. So let me just think about the portrait video on Samsung and the cinematic video here for the front-facing camera on the iPhone.
Alright, so here's some low light video from the rear cameras on the Galaxy S23 Ultra and iPhone 14 Pro. This is the ultra wide angle camera to start out on each at 4K 30 frames per second. So I'm just panning around to give you a side-by-side view of these ultra wide angle cameras and how they compare in this particular scene here at night. Obviously well lit, so you can see how they're doing with some pretty optimal light. And let's go ahead and move into the main camera on the S23 Ultra and on the iPhone. So you can see they got a little bit brighter, a little bit wider apertures on these main cameras. And so it's going to be a little bit brighter overall. You can see the more definition on that tree line now. It's much more visible against the skyline. You can see how this is now doing on the main camera against that really bright street light. It's definitely going to flare it out more as expected. But let's go ahead and pan around this way and we'll test stabilization as well as walk over to a more challenging lighting situation, a bit darker, so you can see how these cameras do with less light compared to that really well lit scene back there. Also pay attention to any kind of micro jitters you're seeing in the stabilization. That's pretty common in low light. And already it's getting a bit darker, but these cameras, like they always do, in auto mode, they're going to try to brighten things up and lift up the shadows and brighten up the overall scene, which they're definitely doing right now. And you can see that really bright light over there and what that's doing to picture quality here. And as we pan up into the night sky, you'll see there's a lot more noisy, more artifacts because of that light pollution. We'll pan down this way where it's a little bit darker down this alleyway, but you can still see it's trying to brighten things up, so you're going to see a lot more noise still. So if you want to get rid of that, you want night to look like night, you just go in Pro mode on the S23 or in auto mode on each, lock your exposure and tone it down, and it'll get darker and it'll look much more realistic. So I'm going to show you an example of that and you can compare it to what you're seeing right now. Alright, so we're back. This is still 4K with the HDR video off. I just turned down the exposure right now, so it's looking a lot more realistic, not nearly as bright, not as much noise. I'm sure this is much more preferred for most people, at least to me. I think the other footage looked pretty terrible, and here was what it looks like with that really bright street light, and again back up into the night sky, not nearly as much artifacting. So if you want night to look like night, I suggest either go into Pro mode or in auto mode like this and lock in some of the exposure and autofocus and turn down the exposure to get things looking a lot more realistic. And I think this looks a lot better here, but let me know what you think. So here's some low light video from the front facing cameras, and this is being shot at their max resolutions at 4K and at 30 frames per second, even though they can shoot 60 frames per second. But like I always say, 60 frames per second is a little bit too dark at night for me, so I just don't use it. And just take note that they're both actually shooting in HDR, so that is turned on here. And stay tuned to the end, I'll let you know my initial takeaways and thoughts as well. But from what I'm seeing in the viewfinder, the iPhone is leaning towards a more warmer color tone like it typically does. And I also like to start out in this spot because it has a lot of light, so it shows you what these front-facing cameras can do and some pretty optimal light here at night. But we'll just go ahead and start walking to not only test the stabilization, but also move over to a bit of a darker area, a little bit more challenging lighting situation as well, so you can see how the cameras do there. And I'm walking by a water fountain here to my right, so we'll see how these microphones handle that background noise against the sound of my voice. And we'll pan all the way around here, so we'll see how these front cameras do into those really bright street lights behind me. I'm actually handling those pretty well, not throwing them out at all, pretty much, and doing a really good job, I think. And so let's go ahead and back over here into this darker area so you can see how these front-facing cameras handle this lower light situation side by side. And like most front-facing cameras, they're going to try to brighten things up, so you're going to see more noise and artifacting in a darker area like this, which is pretty typical.
But like I said, my initial takeaways here between these two phones are that as far as color, like I always say for Samsung and Apple, if you're gonna shoot in full auto, then it's just gonna come down to the color science and the color reproduction that you like, because the image signal processing handles it differently between the two phones. But of course, if you're gonna use a pro formats and you're gonna color grade and color correct in post, then you don't really have to worry about that. But my main takeaway is if you like to shoot macro photos or close-up photos like me, like you saw with the flower photos in the beginning, is that usually telephoto cameras, when you use them to try to take macros, is going to switch over to a digital zoom off the main lens, because telephoto cameras typically can't focus at close range because they're meant to capture things farther away. But the 3x telephoto on the S23 Ultra will actually take close-up photos. So at close proximity, it won't default back to the main camera at a digital zoom. You can actually use that 3x telephoto at a pretty close proximity to take some macro photos like you saw with some of the flower photos at the beginning of the video. So that's a pleasant surprise here with the S23 Ultra if you like to take macro photos like I do. Also for video, it's a bit surprising. Just looking at the preliminary video, I actually thought that the S23 Ultra kept up pretty well with the iPhone. Maybe not as well in shadow detail, but overall video quality looked pretty good and pretty close to the iPhone, even the HDR video. So I'll go and look at it again just to check, but let me know what you thought about the video quality there. And like Apple usually does, they don't really prioritize zoom, and so their max zoom isn't very far and the quality isn't very good, so it's not really competing at all with the Samsung as far as zoom range, and that just doesn't seem to be a priority for Apple, which is a bit of a shame. But that's just my initial thoughts and takeaways. Do let me know what you thought and which one you preferred and why. Let me know in the comments, and we'll continue our conversation down there. And as always, thanks for watching.